Christine Emba, we're here to talk about January 6th, Roe versus Wade, American democracy, the November elections. What are you going to tell me?
You know, today I think I'm going to tell you about how the January 6 hearings have been a surprising success for Democrats and how Republicans may have actually shot themselves in the foot by overturning Roe v. Wade. Unfortunately, I think we're also going to have to talk about how America still seems scarily in decline.
So, Christine, you know, we all saw the footage from January 6th, 2021, obviously.
As we understand it, in the last few moments, Congress, you can see there behind me, has gone into full lockdown. No one is able to enter or leave the building.
But obviously that was, a year and a half ago. But we're having these January 6th hearings. I mean, what is the purpose of them and why are they happening?
So we have to remember that our congresspeople are still institutionalists and still very much believe in the power of procedure and process. They want to make it clear that this is a real thing that happened, that democracy was in danger, and that by stating that case clearly, we can hopefully prevent it happening again. So they actually want to lay out with full evidence. They've now done a lot of background research, interviewing witnesses, etc. They want to lay out the case that this is Trump's fault, show exactly how it happened, what evidence they have to, sort of maybe convict him with a crime, but at the very least prevent him from being elected president again. And to state clearly to the American people that what happened was crazy, but also importantly wrong and shouldn't be tolerated. And they want to make that case very, very clearly and very, very plainly and broadly so that all of the American people can actually understand what happened that day.
What does that say, though, about America, that what from the outside one would say is, well, it was kind of clear it was a Donald Trump rally, he sort of encouraged it, maybe he didn't incite it. What does it say about America that you need to have hearings to sort of say, oh, by the way, this was crazy and this did happen?
I mean, it doesn't say anything good, right? I think it speaks to the fact that America is incredibly polarized right now, that so many Americans are, deriving their news and information from a wide variety of, sites and platforms that may or may not be giving them the full story. The idea, I think, is that if this comes from Congress, comes actually from government, that it has evidence from people who were there that day, it should be believable. Of course, that may not actually be the case because we are at a moment in our history right now where a significant number of Americans don't even believe what comes from their government.
What have been the standout moments from the hearings for you?
I think the moment that I remember most clearly that stands out for me is the January 28th testimony. It was a surprise testimony of Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' aide, Cassidy Hutchinson. This was an unannounced hearing. It came as a surprise to almost everyone, and the testimony that this young woman gave was incredible. I mean, basically, she was called upon to give evidence to the fact that, Trump knew that there were people who were armed at his rally and that actually he wanted them to go to the Capitol and, in fact, pressed for security to be reduced so that they could get there. But she describes his behavior and statements on the day of January 6th in a way that made him seem totally insane. She gave testimony about how he was so upset that he himself wasn't allowed to go to the rally that he threw plates at the wall. And she describes ketchup, streaming down the walls of the White House. She describes how she heard that he lunged at the throat of his limousine driver who refused to take him to participate in the insurrection himself.
The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol." Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel. And when Mr. Renato had recounted this story to me, he had motioned towards his clavicles.
These were portraits of Trump as a deranged person, not just sort of a procedural thing, but actually sort of a visceral vision of just how bad the White House had gotten. And I think they really had an effect.
And I think it's also important to point out that she is a 25-year-old woman, testifying at the same time that the likes of Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, her own boss, her former boss, Mark Meadows, aren't testifying.
Right, exactly. I mean, another thing about her testimony was, she talked about trying to speak to Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, and him being almost catatonic, just looking at his phone and saying, like, no, I don't want to go in there. I don't want to bother him. Not only showing that Trump was out of control, but that all of the people around him felt powerless to stop this from happening, or at least didn't feel responsible enough to take action. It was a damning indictment of the whole situation.
And the premise of the hearing so far, it seems to be that ever since election night, Donald Trump was told by, firstly his close aides, including, his daughter, that the election was free and fair, you've lost. He sort of goes out to the states to try and get them to overturn it. He goes down the court routes, lawsuits, fails, and it all sort of ends up with January 6th and possible links with, far-right militia. And including, another standout moment from the testimony was this December 18th night where the so-called Trump crazies, Sidney Powell, all went into the White House, it seems, unannounced to try and sort of goad Trump. And then the likes of his, White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, find out, they rush in. And a 6-hour long meeting/argument where people could hear people shouting outside, and it went round the Oval Office and through the West Wing and into the private residence. The whole thing paints this sort of slow build-up as well as astonishing scenes.
Astonishing scenes is right. I actually think that this is going to be one of the most useful parts of the January 6 hearings for the general public. Even if, the average American doesn't understand the ins and outs of sort of the Justice Department questions around how many electors and where, the fact that there were so many moments, so many images painted so clearly of Donald Trump and his closest advisors being just insane, incorrigible, and not able to be trusted with anything. The behavior described is so out of the ordinary that it's really breaking trust.
And that's an interesting point. The first hearing was in prime time. It got 19 million viewers. Are people watching this, do you think? You and I are very interested in this and find it fascinating. But do you think others are watching and listening and taking it in?
I actually think that they are. And I think that, frankly, as the revelations from the hearings have become crazier and crazier, more people are tuning in. One poll I've read has said that at least 40% of Americans say that, either hearing news of the hearings or watching the hearings themselves has sort of changed the tenor of their understanding of the Trump administration.
And, digging into the polls, I keep on thinking of one where there's a poll about Republicans, which says 60% of them think January 6th was a legitimate protest. Only 13%, 1-3, think it was an insurrection. But on the other hand, there are polls which show that Donald Trump's popularity amongst Republican voters is slowly declining. Ron DeSantis could challenge him when it comes to 2024. So how do we read into those two polls in terms of a lot of Republicans still think it's a legitimate protest, but some of them are also sort of maybe going off Trump?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I was going to bring up Ron DeSantis too, actually.
Who's the governor of Florida?
He's the governor of Florida. He was actually sort of a protege of Trump who, endorsed him for this role and now is probably going to run for president against Trump in 2024. As we talked about before, we still unfortunately have this sort of information bubble polarized split where, Republicans and conservatives just believe very different things about America than Democrats do and then the actual truth. That said, I do think that some of these hearings are beginning to pierce the bubble. At first, Fox News, sort of conservative channel, didn't carry them at all. It has started to report on them, where they were actually kind of forced to the day of the Hutchinson hearing because it was, simply so crazy. Ron DeSantis, I think, is taking advantage of this moment, actually. When Trump, who was, I think seen as the prospective president for 2024, is now, firmly lodged in the public's mind as a crazy person, Ron DeSantis looks like just a calmer, less embarrassing possibility. And actually, we have seen reports, not necessarily polls, but from Republican insiders, that Republican donors, especially mega donors, who previously supported Trump for a second presidential run, have swung their support to Ron DeSantis.
Was there a mistake from the Republicans? Because the committee has 9 members, 7 Democrats, just 2 Republicans, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who both voted to impeach Donald Trump. You know, the rest of the Republicans, you know, Kevin McCarthy, their leader in the House, you know, refused to basically go along with this committee. So there aren't any sort of pro-Trump Republicans on that committee. So essentially what you have in those hearings is, you know, a free-for-all where 9 people who are clearly anti-Trump could just say what they want, and there's no voice sort of hitting back. Has that been a mistake for the Republicans? Because, you know, maybe at the beginning they thought we could try and forget about this, but if you've had, you know, 7 or more hearings where it's constant information, which is incredibly damaging, and there's no one, you know, chiming on the other side, you know, that's a tactical error, isn't it?
You know, that's a really good point. And I'm interested in seeing how this plays out. You know, the thing with the January 6 hearings and Republicans who refused to join the committee is that, honestly, I think they knew that there's not much defense to be had here. You know, like, what are you going to get on the January 6th committee and say under oath defending Donald Trump's plan to overturn the election? Better to sit outside, say that the whole thing is illegitimate, and be able to lob whatever lies that you want. And that's what Donald Trump's sort of main congressional supporters, the Kevin McCarthy's, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, have been doing from the sidelines. I think they may have the effect of dissuading some Republican supporters who were already deep in Trump world and deep in that camp. But there's not that much they can do when the truth is rolling out in front of them.
And it's interesting, you know, when you talk about the Ron DeSantis types. You know, I was talking to a Republican pollster who said, you know, you may look at these hearings and think this is a great moment for Democrats. But he sort of had this argument, which was that because these are showing just how fringe and crazy some of the ideas are on that, you know, far right Trumpian side of the party, that it's pushing Republican voters to go more for the Ron DeSantis's, the Glenn Youngkins, the governor of Virginia, who sort of, they don't say the election was stolen, you know, but they do sort of go along with the sort of culture wars, anti-woke stuff. They sort of find a middle ground. And that's actually beneficial for the Republicans in the long run, because if you get really fringe, crazy candidates, as we've seen in sort of the Arizona governor race, in Michigan, that really puts off, you know, independents and other voters, and it loses them seats.
It could be. I mean, one thing about the Trump administration and the vast number of sort of fringe crazies that he brought along with him was that they made things very unstable, actually. A very uncertain time period where you didn't know if you could trust any officials or whether the government was going to exist the next day, basically. I think that most voters, not the fringe voters, but most voters are looking for some semblance of normalcy, something that they can rely on. Culture war topics, you know, do raise the blood, but they aren't going to result in the destruction of your country necessarily. And so that might be something easier to defend.
So overall with the hearings, do you think they're a bigger win for the Democrats or the Republicans? And will the hearings have any bearing on the November midterms?
I think that the hearings are clearly a win for Democrats in the fact that they have seriously damaged, you know, Donald Trump and his re-election campaign for 2024. And they've made a number of Republicans in Congress look foolish, look like liars, look like people who don't care about our country. That said, I'm not sure that they're going to have a huge impact, at least this November. In the midterms, people are saying that their major concerns are the economy and inflation. Those are not going to be impacted by sort of a backwards-looking vision of what happened last year.
Another big issue, though, that's come along was the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade.
Even though America was braced for the decision, it was nonetheless momentous. 50 years' worth of women's rights in America overturned in an instant as the Supreme Court, whose very purpose is to protect civil liberties, took away the constitutional right to abortion.
Is that seen as a pivotal moment for Democrats who think they can use this to energize not just their base, but independents as well as, you know, a fairly sizable number of Republicans who are pro-choice.
It's a funny thing to analyze what Democrats think they can use and what actually works. People have really strong feelings about this. It seems like everyone is mobilized. But actually, when you look at, the average voter, while there is concern about abortion, it's still kind of a second-tier issue for most people. Maybe about 20 to 30% of voters even rank it among their top concerns. And actually, polls have found recently that only 5% of Democrats and actually 0% of Republicans think that it will change their vote or affect their vote in the midterms. Those people may be mobilized, but that's not very many people, actually, despite the perhaps outsized conversation.
Because there were some, grumblings within the Democratic Party that Joe Biden wasn't being vocal enough, strong enough when it comes to Roe versus Wade, saying, let's push legislation, like, even if it doesn't get through in the House or the Senate, we have to be seen to be doing something. Is that a fair enough assessment, or do you think he's stepping back and saying this isn't something that is going to be hugely effective for me when it comes to November?
I mean, I do think that was probably his calculation. That is exactly the criticism that he got from, what he and his administration decry as activists, that he should be doing something, setting up abortion clinics on federal land, something. But I think the Biden administration, knows that most Americans, including, frankly, most Democrats and most Republicans, are actually kind of in the mushy middle about abortion.
Conversely, do you think there is an argument to be had that, Biden came in and said, I'm going to unify, I'm going to go for bipartisanship, this is the way forward, forget about the Trump years?
I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify, who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States.
But actually, at some point, does he need to sort of accept that America is really polarized? And you're not going to, you might get some Republicans who join you on a, gun control bill, which you have to water down to appease them, but you're not going to get them to join you on any abortion legislation. You're not going to get them to join you on any, Build Back Better climate legislation.
Biden entered the office saying that he would be a unifier, sort of a quiet presence, and that was attractive. But at a certain point, Americans also want the government to do something. They want the president to be vigorous in some way. And Biden's conciliatory nature has meant that none of his promises, really, any that depended on Republican support especially, have come through. That's becoming frustrating. There's calm and then there's stagnation. And I think that many Americans are worrying that Biden has leaned towards stagnation instead of recovery.
Going back to January 6th, they're saying, look, this is important because we're here to try and save democracy. But also the Democrats kind of don't really like the democratic system, do they? Because the gerrymandering they see as really unfair. The Senate makeup means that, that stymies their legislation, even though the Democrats, I think, overall represent within the Senate a lot more Americans, just by the nature of, Wyoming with hardly any people having just as many senators as California with all of its people. But also going up to the Supreme Court, where you now have a conservative majority, 6-3, three of them, put in place by Donald Trump, who lost the popular vote twice. Is that a route which the Democrats should go down? You say they should be angry. Should they be angry, as some are, to say we need to pack the Supreme Court, put more people in there? Is it about a fundamental wholesale change of the whole system?
That's tough. As I said before, Americans do like stability. Something about changing the system from the bottom up is not necessarily attractive in a climate where so many things feel uncertain. But, I want to push back on what you were saying about Democrats not liking democracy. Mm-hmm. I think that Democrats do actually really like democracy. Sort of a true idea of representative democracy where votes count equally, where perhaps Wyoming does not get as much say over the entire, citizenship of California as it does. And right now, I think what we're seeing is an increasing sort of divide between what representative democracy looks like and what democracy as built into American institutions looks like. Our institutions right now seem kind of divorced from that idea. There's minoritarian rule, basically, as you pointed out, in the Supreme Court, in the Senate, and come midterms, probably in the House of Representatives as well.
You look at something like the Supreme Court, and the argument, I guess, on the Republican side would be like, hey, just because you don't like the court now doesn't mean that you can change the rules.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, as I said, I think changing institutions is an alarming prospect. At the same time, we're seeing American trust in institutions just plummeting. A recent poll showed that only 25% of Americans think that the Supreme Court is a legitimate institution. That's the lowest it has ever been, and it's an 11 percentage point drop from just last year. So even everyday Americans, I think, are clearly seeing that, something is off between what they desire as citizens and what is happening in their government.
How worried, therefore, does all of that, looking towards November, thinking about the long-term ramifications of January 6th, make you feel about the future of this country?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I am really worried. I'm, I think, fairly young, but even talking to older Americans who lived through times of crisis in the 70s earlier have said to me, America's never felt quite this divided before, at least in my living memory. I wonder if this could be a moment in which Americans eventually sort of wake up to just how gridlocked government has gotten, how unresponsive it has become to their needs, and, decide to make a change. I'm interested, for instance, in, the abortion debates where it feels like Republicans have, by hook or by crook, by gerrymander and by minoritarian Supreme Court, have finally, overturned Roe v. Wade. It's sort of a dog catches car moment, because now they're going to be on the hook for enforcing these extremely unpopular decisions and pieces of legislation that they've been sort of waving about for years.
Are you more worried about the sort of, the gridlock in the system and the question marks around democracy which come from January 6th? Or is it also the violence behind January 6th? I mean, the violence behind political rule has always been there. January 6th doesn't stand alone in the sense of 2017. Just a few weeks ago, you had members of a far-right group arrested on their way to disrupt, quote, a pride march in Idaho. Is that not the worry as well? It's about that militia-type far-right extremism, which January 6th showed. And January 6th showed it as not unique. It was just one particular day, and that still exists.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, to tack back to the very beginning of our conversation, I think one of the things that the January 6th committee is trying to do with these hearings is to show that, this sort of activity is happening, that it's real, it's not a joke, and should not be accepted or tolerated in a democratic system. And yet, even as those hearings are going on and we're, still reeling from the fallout of January 6th, yeah, these militias keep cropping up. America is full of guns, and it seems like despite our mass shootings, people are only buying more. The threat of violence does seem more real now than it has in a long time, and that is scary.
I guess on that point, to finish off, the political scientist Barbara Walter has written a book recently called How Civil Wars Start. And she wrote that no one wants to believe that their beloved democracy is in decline or headed towards war. The decay is often so incremental that people often fail to notice or understand it, even as they're experiencing it. If you were an analyst in a foreign country looking at events in America, you would go down a checklist, assessing each of the conditions that make civil war likely, and what you would find is that the United States has entered very dangerous territory. It feels very, extreme to go that far to talk about a civil war, but are you, when I talk to some people, they're really worried about what November and 2024 might bring. Are you worried about that kind of thing playing out in America?
America has already had one civil war. It was a terrible time for us. I don't know that I'm worried about civil war physically, specifically, but that quote rings, unfortunately, terrifyingly true.
And what scares you about it?
Unfortunately, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and everything that followed after was a decline, a steep decline that perhaps we didn't notice at first, and we sort of normalized or ignored this slow chipping away of norms, this increasing sort of distance from reality of, at times more than half of the American voting population. And then we had a pandemic, which separated people even further. And eventually, I think we're going to see those chickens come home to roost. That tension, that dispersal, that anger that's welling up in, yes, conservatives, but at certain points, Democrats too. One of the scary things about January 6th and the last election is now, even though the committee is saying that this is unacceptable, there is now precedent for how one might disrupt an election. For Donald Trump, the problem was that he was undisciplined and his compatriots were incredibly incompetent. But, what if there is someone competent next time?
Christine Emba, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.